I begin by acknowledging that Ottawa, where the International Academy of Research in Indigenous Management and Organisation Studies hosted the inaugural consortium, is on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. I greet and honour the First Peoples of the land upon which this presentation is made. I introduce myself in my language and through my culture. These are the tribes that are the foundation of my identity. My first greeting is to your ancestors. My second greeting is to you. My third greeting is to your unborn descendants. I greet us all. Ko waio, ko Ngāti Kahu ki Whangaroa, Ngāti Kuri me te rārua o ku iwi, ko Ella Henry tōku ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. In this presentation, I briefly discuss the history and culture of Maori, the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. The Koru of Maori ethics is a model founded on the values and beliefs shaping traditional Maori society. These traditional ethics inform contemporary knowledge, research, and theories across management and organisation studies and across a wide range of topics and disciplines, including traditional knowledge, leadership, investment and finance, kinship and spirituality, and women and gender equality. In the ancient Maori world, we know from archaeology and linguistic and DNA evidence that we are part of the Austronesian diaspora, a community that has been populating the Pacific for over 3,000 years, arriving in Aotearoa over the last 1,000 years and sharing a culture with many of our Austronesian kin. For example, our traditional communities were tribal, kinship-based, egalitarian societies, where identity was reinforced through our genealogical connection to each other and to the places that we identified, found, and named. And that connection was both pragmatic in terms of where we came from, but also spiritual. We have what has been defined as an economy of affection, as opposed to a capitalist political economy. Traditional Maori society was founded on reciprocity and gift giving, how we affected each other and were affected by each other. And so the culture and the values maintained social control. In other words, the culture was the religion, the culture was the social control system. So Māori were much impacted by the arrival of visitors from the outside world, beginning with Abel Tasman in 1641 and then James Cook in 1769, which opened the door to many more visitors, particularly whalers and sealers, throughout the period from the 1790s onwards. Now, what that meant is that Māori engaged very actively in trade with these outsiders, and that fundamentally transformed Māori society from an economy of affection to one involved in trade. What that meant, though, was that Māori became quite vulnerable to external trading regulations. For example, in 1831, one of the vessels that was trading into Sydney was taken in by the government there because it was not flying a national flag and was therefore perceived to be a pirate. So one of the responses to that was the coming together of a group of the chiefs in 1835 and forming what in English was called the Declaration of Independence, acknowledging that the country was a nation state and creating a flag. Now, that flag was accepted by the British Parliament in 1836, which gave Aotearoa and the chiefs nationhood status and the protection of the British Royal Navy, which facilitated trade. So it would seem that the creation of a treaty between Māori and the British Crown only 5 years later in 1840 would be perceived as a continuation of that positive, warm relationship that had occurred since Cook arrived in 1769. So what happened was on February the 6th, 1840, the first of the chiefs began to sign the treaty, which then travelled around the country, and New Zealand was formally annexed as a British colony. Unfortunately, we know from history that the impacts of that relationship has proved to be devastating for Maori people. And as you can see, as you look just at the map of the North Island, and the loss of Maori land between 1860 and 1930 has had a profound and devastating impact on Maori. In fact, it was assumed that we would have died out by 1900 as the process of assimilation, the breakdown of the economic foundations, and the cultural morass that occurred as our language and our traditional healing methods and knowledge systems became illegal in some cases, certainly frowned upon the use of the Maori language and Maori culture. So this again contributed to the negative consequences of colonisation for Maori people. As has been previously said, up until the war, really Māori suffered the most dire consequences of colonisation, of rural poverty, of disease, of a lack of access to resources. And that was certainly the case up until the Second World War, when a proportionally large number of Māori men lost their lives in theatres of war around the world. What happened in the industrial boom after the Second World War was the result of growth and revitalisation of New Zealand's economy, which resulted in a massive migration of Māori from traditional rural communities that were often very impoverished, where there was little work and little opportunities, to the larger urban centres. And that, of course, meant tribal dislocation, urban revitalisation in a completely different way. What was really interesting, though, is that many of the children and grandchildren of that generation who came to the cities had greater access to formal education. And for many of those young folk, they were introduced to the truth of our history for the first time. Because whilst we may have been disgruntled in our rural tribal communities, we had really been convinced that New Zealand had ideal race relations. And it was not until the truth was exposed about the repressive legislation, the expropriation of land, the open warfare, the massacres of our people. When that was exposed, it really revitalised a sense of protest and activism, and that began to arise in the 1970s when there were protest movements all around the world, whether it was for the anti-nuclear stance or protesting against Vietnam or women's liberation, Black Power. There was a huge rise in activism, and Maori were very much a part of that, which of course had consequences in this country for the political and legal and social environment that we were in, as we started to gain more political power and a stronger political voice, which meant that governments had to react and respond. And so in this country, the Waitangi Tribunal was set up first in 1975, but then given power to look retrospectively to 1840 in 1985, and that began a slew of claims to the Waitangi Tribunal from tribes arguing the case that the colonial government and even the contemporary government had breached the terms and conditions of the treaty, and that then informed tribal settlement, often financial, and that financial tribal settlement has underpinned an enormous amount of development and business over the last 40 years. So that we see that there has been a transformation, not just economically, but also in terms of intellectual and political transformation, as Maori have united across multiple fronts, not only to be activists, but also to lead around economic transformation, around intellectual and academic developments. But they very much came out of the protest movements of the 70s, which were based on traditional values and, more importantly, aspirations for self-determination for Maori people. And so this image of the Land March of 1975 shows how Maori were united And non-Maori joined in 1975 to ask for our language to be acknowledged and for no more land to be taken from us. And that was very much 1975, a pivotal change, not just in Maori society, but a transformation for New Zealand society. Now, as I previously mentioned, the Koru of Maori ethics is a model that was developed by Maori scholar Manuka Henare in the 1990s, an ethno-historian who wrestled with how we take traditional ancient knowledge from a culture that did not keep a written history, and how do we transform that into contemporary knowledge, and how do we apply that and utilize those ancient knowledges to enhance and improve our society. And Manuka based his Koru of Maori ethics model on the silver fern, which is the national plant of New Zealand, and the way that the silver fern fronds unravel, because that shape, the Koru, is resonant throughout Maori art. And of course, Maori art in a culture that has no written language, our art is our archive, it is our library, it is our museum. So our stories, our art, our music are how we hold on to information and knowledge and transfer that intergenerationally. And what Manuka found was that traditional Maori ethics were based on a notion of what is right, and the word for that is tika. And the word tikanga evolves out of that which is right, and that is the practices that reflect our appreciation of what is right. So tikanga is a word well known and often applied in contemporary New Zealand and Māori society. And there are a range of tikanga, many of which have started to be incorporated not only into New Zealand legislation, but into contemporary practice. And I'm going to address a few of those types of tikanga and how they are reflected in contemporary practice that is based on ancient and traditional knowledge. So the first of these tikanga that I want to address is the idea of mātauranga, and mātauranga is glossed as knowledge, often relating to traditional knowledge. Mātauranga Māori, however, spans not just ancient knowledge, but all forms of knowledge, whether it is embedded in culture, values, philosophy, worldview. Mātauranga is very much that word that encapsulates the broad breadth of Maori understandings of the world, Maori worldview and philosophy. And that idea of mātauranga includes knowledge that's been generated using techniques that are consistent with a scientific method, but explained according to the Maori worldview. So there's been some tension in the country, particularly in recent years when the current government promoted the idea that it was going to incorporate Maori knowledge as a form of science in the student curriculum into high schools. And this prompted a group of senior New Zealand scholars to write a letter to one of the big newspapers in the country saying that they disagreed with that Maori knowledge was important, but it was not a science, that there was only one form of science and that it was based on, rigorous use of techniques consistent with the scientific method. Well, Maori would argue that our ancient knowledge is that. And in fact, there was a huge backlash to that letter, as many around the country disagreed vehemently with those people and recognised that, in fact, Maori knowledge is a valid form of science, that not all science has to be Western, Eurocentric, quantitative, that, in fact, there are multiple realities and sciences across many cultures around the world. And so Mātauranga has actually formed the basis of a treaty claim to the Waitangi Tribunal, numbered Waitangi Tribunal Claim 262. It's often been called the Flora and Fauna Claim because that was how it was originally perceived, but in fact it covers all forms of knowledge and intellectual property that were owned by Maori at the time that we signed the Treaty of Waitangi that have not been adequately protected by the Crown. But Clause 2 or Article 2 of the treaty guaranteed in both the Maori language version and the English language version that the government, the Crown, would protect all that is precious to the Maori. In the Maori language version, it's called tauranga. And in the English language version of Article 2, it's all things that Maori consider precious. And of course, knowledge and intellectual property is one of the most important of those precious things to be protected by the Crown, which did not occur. And so this is increasingly accepted in Aotearoa New Zealand as a legitimate form of knowledge and science that deserves protection and enhancement by the Crown. So we wait at the moment to see what the Crown is going to do in terms of that treaty claim. But more importantly, traditional knowledge, mātauranga, has been woven into and incorporated into contemporary management and organisational practice, so that we find traditional practices like our welcome ritual, what we call the porphyry, is often used in contemporary organisations to welcome new staff. The idea of group decision making through hui is now incorporated much more across government agencies and in fact corporate enterprise around the country, as well as community groups. So these are two types of tikanga: the welcome ritual, the porphyry, the hui as a decision making strategy, that have been woven into management and organisation practice because mātauranga is increasingly being recognised as having value in the society, and the ways that we practice business, the ways that we practice organisation and culture. So leadership is another area that has been much changed and in fact influenced particularly by early research that was conducted in this country by the British, very Eurocentric patriarchal views of our society and our culture, which were used primarily to serve the colonial agenda for assimilation. So the early recorded histories of Maori, as I said, were very much focused on looking at male-centric power rather than understanding the egalitarian nature of traditional society, or the notion of hui, collaborative decision-making, as opposed to the more Eurocentric idea of top-down power. So that influenced leadership to a large extent over time. However, more recent research that has been conducted by Māori scholars has highlighted that, in fact, traditional leadership beliefs and practices can still apply in contemporary contexts. And part of a way of understanding that is by looking at the word rangatira. So ranga means to bring together, tira means people. So rangatira tanga is the activity of bringing people together. And that was very much our view of traditional leadership, which is reflected in contemporary leadership, where you have Maori who understand our traditional knowledge and apply that in their leadership practices. So you're more likely to see Maori leadership that is relational, that is focused on servant leadership, or ethical leadership that's founded on values of connection and egalitarian rights and responsibilities for both men and women. Now keep in mind that when we signed the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 with the British and we became British citizens, we became British citizens at a time when in Britain women were merely chattels who were owned by their fathers until they were given away to their husbands. So this whole Eurocentric patriarchal model very much influenced the way that Maori were treated in the early colonial period, until we've been able to make those fundamental changes through our own research and then in the way that is applied in our organisational contexts. And so it's increasingly accepted that these are the ways that we exercise leadership, and that is reflected in the leadership and the way that our organisations are led and managed. Now, another area that is really of interest in terms of how traditional values and practices are influencing contemporary ideas and practices is around investment and finance. So investment and finance is becoming increasingly of interest because Maori and the government are aware that the economy, the Maori economy, is growing in value. Now, it was calculated at being worth 70 billion in 2021 and is expected to be worth 100 billion by 2030. So this is a significant chunk of New Zealand's GDP, and how Maori invest and how Maori use our finances is of growing concern, not just to Maori, but to the wider economy. Recent studies have found that both Maori organisations that may not be tribally owned but are still very Maori centric and tribal enterprises are beginning to focus more on their own unique investment strategies. And these are around a more sustainable, environmentally ethical, long-term, much longer-term strategy than the traditional short-term investment model that is quite commonly utilised in finance and investment, because the ultimate focus of this kind of investment is intergenerational wealth, not just for the here and now, but for future generations, and also taking into consideration the need for multiple bottom lines, not just financial, but social, cultural and environmental imperatives that guide decision making around how finances are invested. And so all of these investment strategies, all of them are underpinned by very traditional values and ethics that shape the way Maori are incorporating ancient knowledge into contemporary practice. Now, whanaungatanga me wairua literally mean kinship and spirituality. And why is this incorporated in management and organisation practice? Because there's a growing body of research that has recognised that Maori business, Maori communities are a really important way of strengthening kinship and belonging, that our organisations, whether they are tribal or Māori-centric, are an important way of bringing together our communities, of increasing the resilience and the well-being of those communities. So using business, using organisation as a way of fostering greater sense of whanaungatanga, family, kinship and spiritual connection. And that is very much the case around the ways that our businesses, our communities, and the networks of our businesses and communities enhance what we think of as the capitals. So we know that any kind of networking we do is going to increase the value of our networks, the social capital. But for Maori people, and I would suggest also for other Indigenous peoples, the idea of cultural capital, not in the Bordurian sense of cultural capital and elitism in education, but for Indigenous folk, for Maori people in particular, cultural capital is around enhancing the value of our identity and our culture when we are able to work together and come together. And those are really important side effects of the kinds of organisations we create. And another really important capital that we are able to enhance is spiritual capital. And that is the tangible value of acknowledging the spirit, what is often thought of in common parlance as soul food. When we come together, when we gather, and it was certainly the case when IARIMOS, the International Academy of Research on Indigenous Management and Organisation Studies, was able to meet in Ottawa in August of 2023. This gathering really stimulated the spiritual nature of the connection between participants. Everyone felt that they got a sustenance like soul food from the gathering, and that is particularly true of many of the activities that we engage in as Indigenous folk, that we are able to enhance our capitals through our organisational forms. Not only do we build kinship, but we also strengthen our spirituality, and that's a fundamental component of who and what we are as Indigenous people. So taken together, these capitals enhance not only our communities, but can also encourage entrepreneurial intent and enterprise creation. So when we get our capitals enhanced, we feel better and more positive. And I certainly had that experience when I was able to participate in a powwow the last time I visited Canada and was able to visit Six Nations and attended a powwow there. And, around the cultural capital, capital and the spiritual capital of the gathering was all of the enterprise. So the businesses that promoted and were promoted by the gathering of Indigenous folk at the powwow is a classic example of how kinship and spirituality are a really important part of our business and management environment. Now, the final element of traditional knowledge that I want to bring up relates, and I've touched upon this briefly, around the role of women. So, in traditional society, women were equal. And that, I think, is very much exemplified in our cosmology, which is based on duotheism, not monotheism, where the relationship between the Sky Father, Rangi Nui, and the Earth Mother, Papatuanuku, is exemplified in the relationships between men and women. So women could be chiefs, they could be leaders. There are a number of tribes named for an eponymous ancestor who is a woman. The land was owned by the community, not by the individual, so women had equal ownership rights. Women participated equally in decision making at hui. So all of these things were an important part of traditional women's status, what we call mana, the mana or prestige of women, mana wahine, women and gender equality. Now, unfortunately, that all changed, as I said, when we signed the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, at a time when women in Britain were literally the belongings of their fathers, and that is why they had their father's surname, until they were given away in marriage to a man whose name they would then take, and then all of their children would have that name. So women did not hold the same status in British society in 1840 as Maori women did, and unfortunately we lost that mana as a direct consequence of signing the treaty. And because Maori culture was colonised by these very Anglocentric values of capitalism, individualism, and patriarchy, it had a profound and negative impact on women. And that is certainly the case with a number of treaty claims that are going before the Waitangi Tribunal that are known as the Mana Wahine treaty claims. And the consequence when these claims are being heard is going to be that government policies, strategies, investments are going to have to take account. So every time there is a board opening that a government is required to fill, they're going to also be required to ensure that there is gender equity for Maori men and women. Now, this is going to have a flow on, I believe, to the way all women are treated in the country and more positively. So mana wahine, I think, is going to impact not just Maori women, but all women in New Zealand in a much more positive and egalitarian way. So, in conclusion, and bringing together all of these diverse ideas, what I argue is that Maori scholars and practitioners in business, organisation, tribal leadership, a range of ways, Maori scholars and practitioners are rebuilding the Maori world in the contemporary context, but predicated on a deep understanding of traditional knowledge and how we take the best of that traditional knowledge and incorporate it into contemporary practice. That is the challenge that is facing Maori scholars and practitioners, and there is an exciting body of information that is being developed, published, and disseminated around these very things, because in each publication, presentation, organisation that we create out of this milieu of traditional knowledge, which I suggest is praxis, the bringing together of theory and practice in a praxeological transformation, is contributing to the revitalisation of the Maori world. That is Maori people, culture and society. And I argue that Maori society moving forward is being fundamentally revitalized by the incorporation of traditional knowledge into contemporary practice and ways of looking at the world, whether it's leadership or investment or how we treat women or how we treat the environment or how we treat each other. All of these are moving forward predicated on knowledge that came from our ancestors. And it is this commitment to to revitalization that I believe that we share with many of our Indigenous sisters and brothers around the world, so that we can all move from the darkness of our colonial histories to a more vibrant and resilient future, because we need to be able to do that if we are going to meet our aspirations for self-determination and social justice that are founded on our traditional knowledge, culture, and identity. And that is the place that I would like to leave and conclude this discussion, because it has been very much around the idea that who and what we are as Indigenous peoples shapes not only our history, but also our future. So the following slides are all of the references that I've used for the paper, which is available from the organisers, but I want to finish my presentation to you with this idea, the language that I began with. In Māori culture, when we say tēnā koutou, we are saying you are there, I see you. In the same way that many First Nations peoples of the Americas say you are my relations, I am saying in tēnā koutou, I see you, I acknowledge you, you are there. So I begin as I end as I began, by saying tēnā koutou, I see your ancestors. Tēnā koutou, I see you who are alive now. Tēnā koutou katoa, I see all of your descendants. I greet you all, I acknowledge you all. I bring my spirit to share with you. Greetings.